Welcome back to another podcast in our Sacramental Prep series. These programs are a production of the Faith Formation team at St. Julie Billiart Catholic Church in San Jose, California. In this series, we'll be exploring the question, are we spiritual beings? This is the fifth program of this series in which we've been trying to answer fundamental questions about who or what we are. Most specifically, are we spiritual beings? And if so, what would that even mean? Now, many scientists have said that our genetics and our behavior both point to the fact that we are animals, which certainly doesn't sound very spiritual. And while it is true that most of what we do is inspired by the same instincts that drive animal behavior, there's at least one kind of behavior that doesn't seem to be inspired by any of the animal instincts, and which we've never observed in any animal outside of human beings. That behavior is an unconditional form of love, which the Greeks call agape. The fact that people know how to agape and animals don't turns out to be the key to answering the questions that we've been exploring about what we are and what makes us human beings. Animals don't do agape because everything that they do is driven by their animal instincts to feed, fight, and procreate. There is no animal instinct to love unconditionally, and so animals don't do it. They literally don't know how. But human beings do know how, which means that we must be more than just animals. So if we aren't just animals, well, then what are we? Well, in order to answer that question, in our previous podcast, we began exploring a few fundamental things about reality, and we learned that it can be thought of as having two parts. The first part is called physical reality, which consists of everything that you can detect with your five senses. It's made up of galaxies, stars, and planets, and all of the animals, minerals, and vegetables that they contain, each of which has a size and a weight which can be measured, and each of which is located in some particular place. Now, some people go through life thinking that physical reality is all that there is. But that's simply not true, because every day we experience things that aren't physical. Things like love and hate, and countless other internal emotions and feelings. We have also experienced an awareness of ourselves, a knowledge that we exist. Some people call this their mind, or in a religious context, it may be called the soul. For the purposes of these podcasts, though, we'll refer to it as your consciousness. None of these things can be measured, nor weighed, nor pinned down to any specific location. So they're not part of physical reality. And yet we know that these things are real because we experience them every day. Which means that there must be more to reality than just the physical stuff that you can see or hear or touch with your five senses. And so we decided to use the term spiritual reality to describe things of this kind. So your consciousness exists in your own personal spiritual reality. And your consciousness has a very specific job to do. It decides how to respond to all of these various feelings and emotions. But how does it make these decisions? Should it be ambitious and decide to do your homework? Or should it be lazy and decide to lay around playing games all day? How does it know which emotions and feelings to act on and which ones to ignore? Well, you may have noticed that the things in spiritual reality come in two different kinds. Some of these things, like love, are good, and others, like hatred, are bad. But what about all these others? How does your consciousness know which of them are good things and which ones are bad things? That, it turns out, is the job of your conscience. Now we're going to use an image of Homer here to represent your conscience, just to make sure you don't get it confused with your consciousness. I understand the names sound pretty similar, and they both reside in your spiritual reality, but they're not the same thing. Your conscience knows the difference between right and wrong. And its job is to keep your consciousness informed of this kind of moral information so that you can make better decisions. So let's look at a quick example of how your consciousness and your senses work together. If your senses tell you that there is a 95-mile-per-hour fastball headed for you, it is your consciousness which will figure out that there's a problem and decide to try to get out of the way. Now, one might think that this means your consciousness is in complete control of your behavior, but it's actually a little more complicated than that. As we've seen, an awful lot of what we do is based on animal instincts to feed, fight, and reproduce. Just as your senses keep your consciousness informed about what's happening in the outside world, and your conscience tells it which things are good and which are bad, your animal instincts keep you informed about the things that are happening internally. Again, let's look at an example. Imagine that one day you come home from school to discover that somebody is cooking a tasty rack of ribs. Your nose fills up with that hickory smell of burning charcoal. Your senses report this information about the outside world to your consciousness. But before your consciousness tells you to go ahead and chow down, there are a couple of things that might be going on internally that it'll want to know. Like, are you hungry or are you already full? Do you even like ribs? Well, to find out, your consciousness will check to see if the sight and the smell of those ribs has activated the animal instinct to feed. If it has, then you're almost ready for dinner. But before you start to chow down, let's not forget that your conscience may also have something to say about it. For example, suppose that your conscience reminds you that your next-door neighbor's daughter is sick and in the hospital. And this morning, your mom got a call from the girl's parents, and she said that she would gladly cook dinner for their family, and she knows that they like ribs. So your conscience reminds your consciousness of all of this and advises it, saying, look, I know those ribs smell good, and the aroma is about to give that chimpanzee up in the corner a heart attack. But if you eat them now, you're going to get into a whole lot of trouble. So why don't you just go in the house and ask Mom if she needs any help with dinner? Now, at this point, there's a couple of thoughts that might be going through your brain. First of all, who knew that the things that go on in your head were so complicated? But secondly, you might be thinking, isn't all of this just in my imagination? Many people are perfectly happy to admit that all of the feelings, urges, and emotions that we've been talking about are real, but they don't think there's anything spiritual about them. They believe that all of these things are just part of physical reality. I mean, take love, for example. Many people still insist that
love is a chemical reaction in the brain.
And as far as they're concerned, that applies to everything that we've talked about. Your consciousness, your conscience, and all of the things that we've been calling spiritual reality, all of it is just a series of electrochemical processes that are happening inside your brain. But as we have gotten a better understanding of how the brain works, we've uncovered some fairly serious problems with this idea. First of all, there's a duration problem. If love really was just a chemical reaction, then it seems like that reaction would have to come to an end sooner or later. But couples that have been married for 20, 30, or 40 years report that the feelings that they have had for one another just deepen and become stronger as time goes on. Now, this is hard to explain if the feelings they're having are just chemicals in their brains. Don't these chemicals ever get used up? How are they replenished? So far, scientists have not been able to answer either question. And then there's the contagion problem. The contagion problem is based on the idea that chemicals are not contagious. That is, if you want some chemicals to react, it's not enough to put them near each other. You have to physically combine them. Then they'll react. But things in spiritual reality don't work that way. They very certainly are contagious. So if you hang around with a person who hates a group of people, before long, you're going to start feeling the urge to hate those people too. And this process can happen very quickly and very violently. Let me show you an example. Have you ever seen what happens at a baseball game when somebody is intentionally hit by a pitched ball? Believing that he's been attacked, the batter's animal instinct to fight gets activated. And quicker than you can say clear the benches, his teammates will join the fight. What this demonstrates is that, unlike chemical reactions, things that happen in your spiritual reality can be contagious. What one person feels is often felt by the people around them. What this means is if consciousness really is just a chemical process that happens inside of your brain, it's not a process that science understands. The scientific community is absolutely divided, split down the middle, about what they think consciousness is or might be. For example, here's Bill Nye.
I don't think there's any consciousness or soul or awareness that exists outside of our physical brains. This is a very difficult question to answer. Extraordinary claims are made on both sides. The molecular people like me and the spiritual people like others. But there's no reason to think, for me, there's no reason to think there's something beyond the physical brain.
Nye is part of a conservative community of scientists that remains convinced that what we're calling spiritual reality can be explained by conventional science. But there is a growing community of scientists that disagrees. For example, here's neurosurgeon Dr. Eben Alexander.
There is a scientific revolution going on now about the mind-brain discussion, the relationship between the two, that is extraordinary. And I think it's going to lead to a complete shift in our worldview that is unprecedented.
And the shift that Dr. Alexander is referring to is not being driven by the religious community. It's being driven by scientific experiments.
The experiments in quantum physics keep showing us in no uncertain terms that consciousness is fundamental, that the conscious observer and our free will has everything to do with determining outcomes. It's not determined by mechanistic chemical reactions and the laws of physics and chemistry applied to the brain.
If Dr. Alexander is right, then consciousness does not depend on the brain, which means it could exist outside of the brain. In fact, recent evidence suggests that consciousness and even intelligence don't require a brain at all. Let me show you what I mean. This is an amoeba. Now, amoebas are the simplest single-celled organisms on the planet. They have no brains at all. And yet they can hunt other microorganisms. Not only that, but when certain kinds of amoebas are faced with a shortage of food, they join their bodies together into something that's called a slime mold. A slime mold is just a bag of amoebas that has figured out how to lift itself up out of the water and look for food up on the shore. Now, intrigued by this behavior, scientists began studying slime molds in the lab. And to their astonishment, they discovered that slime molds that are hunting for food are able to solve a maze in order to find it. Now, solving a maze requires a certain amount of intelligence. And according to conventional science, Intelligence requires a brain, and yet none of the amoebas that make up the slime mold have a brain. In fact, they don't even have any neurons, which are the building blocks of brains. So how can they solve mazes? Could it mean that intelligence can exist outside of the brain? Well, perhaps. But before we try to answer that question, let's take a moment to look back and review what we've learned in this episode. When scientists say
we are animals,
they're absolutely right, but only in physical reality. Unfortunately for science, there is a part of us that resides outside of physical reality, in this thing that we're calling spiritual reality. And this is why we can say that we are spiritual beings. Actually, it's a little more complicated than that. Human beings are both spiritual and physical. Physically, we are animals, just as science says. But we also have spiritual components that no animals share. So now that you understand a little more about what we are, be sure to join us for our 6th podcast, in which we'll determine, once and for all, what all of this means. See you then.